We're very fortunate to have a guest speaker and author tonight with us. It's Edward Pitts. He is a retired attorney, and I'm going to try to get the rest of your resume down.
Okay.
And a former Social Security administrative law judge. Did I get that right?
That's right.
Okay, from Syracuse, New York. And he's not here because of that, and he's not going to check out on your Social Security status, right? But he is very passionate about the Adirondacks, and he's very excited. I know he has been very excited for months to come talk to you about his brand new book, Syracuse University Press, that was just released this spring. Is that correct?
That's right.
On sketching the Adirondacks, letters from the wilderness. And so he's going to be talking to you about that and giving an illustrated view of some of the things that are happening there. So let's give Edward, Ed, I guess you like to be called, a warm welcome. And
Thank you, Chris. Hi, folks. What I'd like to do tonight is give you an idea of what it would be like to be in the Central Adirondacks in 1851 if you were an artist, not a hunter, not a fisherman, not a camper, but an artist, and trying to make your name as an artist. And to do that, I'm going to tell you about this book, Sketching the Adirondacks. I'm pretty sure you won't have ever read any book exactly like this. And the reason I say that is that the book is a mixture of straight history and literary nonfiction, where what I've done is I've taken a real diary of Jervis McEntee, one of the people on the trip, and selected portions from that, and then created letters that he would have written to his friends and family. So the story of the trip is told in the letters, and the history of the trip is told in notes to each letter that explains who the people are, where the information came from, and so on. So as you can see, basically, they went across the Adirondacks, and in the process of doing that, they met literally every working Adirondack guide at the time. They met the settlers, quite a large number of the settlers. They met other travelers. And they stayed at some of the most important places in the Adirondacks for visitors at that time. And I'll be able to show you sort of how that goes. Now, feel free if you see something you want to ask a question about it, let me know during the talk if you want, or you can wait until afterwards and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. Also, of course, please buy a copy of the book when the talk is over. And just so I don't forget about it, I have a previous book, it's called Beaver River Country, and it's a straight history book up the Beaver River Valley over on the western part of the Adirondacks. It has lots of interesting stories in it, but it doesn't have much about this particular story in it.
so say again the time.
1851. So we're before the Civil War and before there's any real tourism at all. Now you can see the dark line on this map going from west to east, almost straight across, is the Carthage, the old Carthage to Lake Champlain Road. It was cut out in 1844. That was when it was surveyed. It was actually created and finished more or less, if you want to consider what they did finish. It still had rocks and stumps, but it was cut out by 1850. So this road was new just before the trip that we're talking about. And the trip essentially followed this road. It didn't stay on the road the whole time, but it followed the general course of this road, starting in Loudville on the west and ending up at Boone River at Roof's Hotel on the east. That trip was approximately 200 miles, the way they did it. They abandoned the road when they could, and rather they wanted to go by water when they could. And the reason for that is that they had very heavy gear. And it was a lot easier to transport that gear in a boat than it was to try to carry it. And wherever they could, they also rented a horse and wagon. And where the road was good enough, they were able to use a horse and wagon to get their gear in. They spent 2 weeks at each of 3 base camps. The first base camp was at Smith's Lake, which you know as Lake Lila. Okay, it was called Smith's Lake back at that time because a hermit had lived there named David Smith. And so everybody called it Smith's Lake. They then spent 2 weeks at Constable Point on Racket Lake. Constable Point today is called the Antlers. If you know anything about Racket Lake, it's a peninsula that's a little bit to the north of the village along that road, and it's owned by SUNY Coral. And then they traveled on up to the high peaks, and they spent 2 weeks at Henderson Lake, which is right outside of the upper works, about a mile from the upper works. So that's where they spent their base camps, and in between they explored around. They went all different places, and I have maps in the book that show exactly where they went, where they camped, all of that sort of thing is all detailed in the book. Now keep in mind that at the time of this sketching trip, there were really no maps, at least no maps with any details of this area. There were no marked trails. There was just this one primitive road, the Carthage to Lake Champlain Road. That was all they had to go by. And they didn't know anything about the Adirondacks when they came. So how do you do that? Well, there's only one way to do that. You have to hire a guide. And I'll tell you a little bit about their guide in a minute. They had no specialized camping gear, so they had heavy clothing, wore wool suits, long underwear, hats. They were, at the time, there wasn't any Adirondack Park. There was no forest preserve. The whole idea of protecting the Adirondacks is something that hadn't come to mind yet. It wouldn't come into public consciousness for another 30 years. So at the time of their trip, there were very few visitors who were just kind of visitors. People came, were either exploring for hunting purposes or for fishing generally. So for 2 artists to do this was very unusual. They weren't the first artists, but they were among the first artists to come.
What's the date? What's the time frame again?
We're talking about 1851.
What time of year?
They left in the middle of June, and it took them until the end of August till they got home.
Okay, thank you.
So it was the summer, and of course, they didn't count on the fact that the middle of June, as we all know, is a time when you can't actually live outdoors. They discovered this quite early on in the trip. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. So next slide. Who are they? Who are these guys? The one that I'm telling you the most about is an artist named Jervis McEntee. Next slide. This is a picture of the family album. This is not in the public domain. This is the only picture I could find of him as a relatively young man. Now, all the other pictures are studio portraits, and they're as he's in his 50s and 60s. So this one is he is born on July 14th, 1828 in Rondout, New York, which is part of Kingston. He was the eldest son of a well-to-do engineer who was in charge of part of the Delaware and Hudson Canal. He's just 23 years old. He's still living at home. He was educated in the local primary school, and then he went to the Clinton Liberal Institute, which is a Universalist secondary school in Clinton, New York. He learned to paint, but pretty much on his own. The most important thing that happened in his life as an artist was between 1850, the winter of 1850 and 1851, he became the student and apprentice of Frederick Edwin Church, who would later become probably the leading of the Hudson River School painters. So as far as I can tell, he really had no camping experience before the trip. So he's going to head out into the Adirondacks with no camping experience.
How old do you think he was in that photo?
As far as, I think what I figured out is he's about 31 in that photo.
Wow.
Okay, next slide. I don't have a picture of Tubby as a young man, but Joseph Tubby was a longtime friend of McEntee's. He also lived in Rondout. They got together frequently to sketch and to paint. Tubby would come to McEntee's house to paint. He was born August 25, 1821, and he was born in England, in Tottenham. And he came to the United States in 1832 as a child of 11. They moved up to the Hudson Valley, and his father worked as a building contractor. He was actually fairly modestly well off by the time of the trip. He would have been 29 at the time of the trip, so he's a few years older than McEntee. By that time, he'd been working for quite a long time, about a decade, in his father's contracting business, where he worked primarily as a house painter, interior decorator, and sign painter. So he had no formal art education at all. He went to primary school, but no other secondary school. He had no formal art education, but he did study for a while later in life with a portrait artist whose name was Black. He also had no camping experience. So here's another guy who doesn't know anything about how to camp. But this next guy, next slide, he does. This guy knows how to camp. This is McEntee's sketch of a guy named Asa Puffer. Asa Puffer lived on a 300-acre farm in Watson in the Black River Valley outside of Loudville. He was born on January 1st, 1818. He was son of a Methodist preacher who was also a farmer. At the time of the trip, he's 33. He's a few years older than the artists, and the artists actually thought he was much older than them, but they didn't know how old he really was. As far as I can tell, he could not read and write. He had no education at all, but he had what the others lacked, which is he had extensive camping experience. He was a farmer, and in those days, you were really on the edge of the wilderness as a farmer. In the wintertime, he worked as logger. When he could, he worked as an axeman. And I don't know if you know what an axeman is, but if you had a survey party and you were going to survey a line, they would cut down the trees that were in the way. And so they hired guys called axemen to cut those trees down. And they didn't have saws at this time. There were no saws being used in the Adirondacks, so they were axes. So he had the experience and all the outdoor skills that the artists lacked. And the trip just wouldn't have been possible without his, and as you can see in the book or some of the stories, there's quite a few times where he saved their skins. They were in bad shape and needed somebody to pull them out of trouble. So the question then comes, why would you go on a sketching trip, and why would you go to the Adirondacks for that trip? But in the decades before the Civil War, aspiring young landscape artists would try to go on a sketching trip somewhere, but they generally would go to the Hudson Valley, the Catskills, New Hampshire, perhaps, to the White Mountains, places that were already somewhat developed. But they decided they would come to the wilderness, and the reason for that is that they were influenced by the early Hudson River School painters, Thomas Cole, and also by Edwin Church. Thomas Cole in 1836 wrote an influential article in a magazine called the American Monthly magazine called Essays on American Scenery. That article argued that the American landscape artist must focus on painting scenes of the natural world because, as he said, quote, the most distinctive and perhaps the most impressive characteristic of American scenery is its wildness. So Cole himself did this. He went off and sketched in the wildest places he could get to. McEntee became familiar with Cole's writing and Cole's work when he was working with Frederick Church in the winter of 1850-51. And I have no doubt that Church described the usefulness of sketching trips, described Cole's sketching trips, because 3 years earlier, Church was Cole's student and went on sketching trips with Cole. And so, they knew that whole thing. So after Church convinced McEntee he should go on a sketching trip, McEntee started to plan the trip. And at the time you talked to Tubby about this, Tubby wanted to go. And so they decided to go along together. And I think share the costs. In the book, the costs are all described The trip itself cost for the two of them for the whole time about $3,300 for the 2 months.
A lot of money.
Well, as McEntee put it put a substantial hole in a $100 bill. He had a sense of humor, and he actually made a drawing of a $100 bill with a hole in the middle and the high peaks in the background. Now, but the question is, why the Adirondacks? So there's 3 reasons, and I'm going to go over each of these reasons a little bit by themselves. So let's have the next slide. The first reason, McEntee himself wrote in his journal that the reason he wanted to visit the Adirondacks was to find and sketch wild scenes such as those described in Joel T. Headley's recently published book, The Adirondack or Life in the Woods. It was published in 1849. It's the year before they decided to plan the trip. During the sketching trip, McEntee's journal records the fact that he was thinking about Headley. Mostly he was thinking about Headley in negative terms. He would complain that the book was inaccurate. It was vague on the details. It was misleading or outright lying about what Headley actually did because he met Headley's guides on the trip. But nonetheless, Headley's book was, in fact, the spark that started McEntee thinking about coming to the Adirondacks and what he might see on a wilderness sketching trip. Let's have the next slide. Entries in McEntee's trip journal, however, make it clear that possibly the most important reason for choosing the Adirondacks was to make sketches of the Indian Pass and the high peaks. This spectacular location near the ironworks was already quite well known, even in 1851. It was first painted by Charles Cromwell Ingham in 1837. Ingham was along with Ebenezer Evans when he did his survey of the geology of the high peaks. And Ingham's painting was exhibited at the National Academy of Design in 1838 to great acclaim. It was so well thought of that a lithograph was made of it by John H. Buford, and it was reproduced in Headley's book. So it's in Headley's book, and that's where McEntee must have seen it. The original painting is now on display, and many of you probably have seen it. It's at the Adirondack Experience in their new painting exhibit at Blue Mountain Lake. So let's have the next slide. There is the copy of the painting. This is Ingham's painting. This painting, you can see it here. The actual painting is 6 by 4, so it's actually, that's 6 feet by 4. It's a big painting. And you can't even see it on this one, but there's actually a painting of a human figure down at the bottom there. It's about, in this thing, about 1 inch high. The lithograph actually is somewhat better than the actual painting in some ways as far as accuracy is concerned. Let's have the next slide. There's the lithograph. And I think this is really quite good. It does a good representation of Ingham's painting, but it also catches some of the details that you might not see so well in Ingham's painting. Now, Thomas Cole, basically what's called the founder of the Hudson River School, he must have seen or at least heard of Ingham's dramatic painting of the past. So in 1846, this is like 5 years before McEntee, Cole made a sketching trip to the Central Adirondacks. He was guided on this trip by John Cheney, the famous guide of the high peaks, who McEntee and Tubby would later meet. Early in the trip, Cheney took Cole to the Indian Pass. And Cole made a series of sketches. These are charcoal sketches of the Indian Pass, which are now in the collection of the Detroit Institute of the Arts. As you can see, Cole's sketch is realistic and closely resembles the right side of Ingham's painting. Let's have the next slide. So this is Cole's sketch. And it really is quite realistic. And it really does capture that same sort of view, the cliff, the pines on the top of the rock, all of that sort of thing all show up here really well. Now, Cole then went on to paint a famous painting called The Indian Pass. Next slide. It doesn't look at all like the Indian Pass. Now, it might be inspired in some way by the Indian Pass, but this doesn't look like the place that we've just been looking at. Nonetheless, this painting became fairly famous, and it's now on exhibit in Texas. Basically, Cole was famous for altering scenes to make them convey the emotion that he felt when he was doing his sketches. So this must have been sort of what he felt. but it doesn't look like the Indian pass. All right, so Church certainly knew about Cole's trip and he knew about the painting, and I'm certain he would have told McEntee about it. So when planning the trip, McEntee and Tubby made visiting the Indian Pass as one of their primary goals. In fact, as soon as they reached the upper works, and this was late in the day, they hiked to the Indian Pass. Now, I don't know, has anybody actually hiked from the upper works to the Indian Pass? It's not an easy hike. And if it didn't have bridges and ladders and all of that stuff, you don't have any of that stuff, it's a harder hike. Okay, so it was a hard hike. Nonetheless, McEntee and Tubby went back to the Indian Pass 4 more times over the next week to sketch and make their sketches. They really wanted to show that they were up to doing something quite arduous and that they were able to capture the wilderness scenes. Now, unfortunately, and even though I've been searching for 3 years, I cannot find any remaining surviving sketches or paintings that they did in the Indian Pass, but we know that they did them. And that's all detailed in the summary of my book here. So the third reason, next slide, is they are young guys. And they wanted to do something that would prove that they could, in fact, conquer the Adirondacks in their own way as artists. They had the energy and they could essentially show that they could do something that might get them noticed. And they might, because they with personal risk and exertion, they thought it was a good way to attract other artists to their work. They were ambitious but unsure of themselves. So this sketching trip both tested their abilities and proved that they were up to it. All right, so let's go to the next slide. Okay, so the question a lot of people ask me about this book is, why did I do this in letters? There is already a wonderful journal, day by day of the trip. Why not just publish that journal? So let me briefly explain. Even though the trip is very well documented, or fairly well documented, and we have this journal, it's at the Adirondack Experience, handwritten copy is there, typescript is there. You can go and see it if you'd like to. Copies are also in the Archives of American Art in the McEntee collection. During the trip, McEntee wrote 2 letters to newspapers, and they were published in newspapers, but they were published in local newspapers, and they weren't identified with his name. They just were identified with his initials. Tubby kept a journal. It sort of still exists. The Archives of American Art has it, but it is so faded it can't be read. So that's a problem. 2 of Tubby's actual letters also still exist in the Archives of American Art. They are legible, and one of them, a typescript, is in the book. So it actually shows his whole letter back to his family and what he did. 8 years after the trip, this is 1859, McEntee anonymously published a magazine article that was lightly fictionalized called The Lakes of the Wilderness. And this includes 18 engravings made from his sketches that he made on the trip. Let's see the next slide. So this is the illustration for the title of Lakes of the Wilderness. And this gives you the first real glimpse of sort of McEntee's talent. I was trying to convince S3 Press to use this image as the cover, but they said it doesn't look like, it looks like it could be cowboys. It doesn't look like the Adirondacks. I disagree with that, but hey, they were the ones who were making the cover. So this is, he did this magazine article, but he fictionalized it. He did it anonymously. He changed the names. You know, it just was, and some of it he put in poetry, songs. This was a Victorian sort of entertainment piece. And it's written in his style. It was very, very nice. But to try to take this material and put it together and annotate it, I tried to do that, and it ended up being unreadable. It was 600 pages, and it just, it was a mess. So I tried to tell the story in a way that made it entertaining. And to do this, the idea came to me as I was working through the journal, and I saw that McEntee almost every other day would write to his friends, his family. He wrote probably several dozen letters. Tell me the same thing. any day it was rainy or it was not able for them to go out, they would write letters. Now you might ask yourself, if you're in the middle of the wilderness, you're writing letters, how do you get these things posted? That's where the Adirondack Guide comes in. They couldn't carry enough food for 2 months. So about every 3 or 4 weeks, the guide would take his empty pack basket, go to town, resupply, come back, usually this taking 3 to 7 days to do that. And in the process, he would take letters out and he would pick letters up and bring them in. So there was communication back and forth during the whole thing. So since I knew that McIntyre told me to writing letters, I figured that these letters, even though I couldn't find any but one, these letters would have had to contain enough context so that people would know what was going on. So what I did was I took key passages from McIntyre's journal and from Tubby's writings, and I took those and then created letters around them to various people that he really knew. And for example, any letters about art went to Frederick Church. Letters about what troubles they were having would go to his parents or to his sister or to his cousin, who was also a painter, that sort of thing. So the best way, I think, to demonstrate how this worked is for me to read part of the letter from the book so you get sort of an idea. So let's have the next slide. This is McIntyre's, it's an etching, but it's an illustration of what the ironworks looked like in 1851. This is the upper works. As you can see, what they made iron using charcoal. They cut down all the trees. They made charcoal out of the trees. So the book contains 30 letters in all. The letter I'm going to read is letter 27, so it's late in the trip. But I chose to read this one because it's about going to the Indian Pass. It's an obvious high point in the trip. So on August 2nd, 1851, they hiked to the high peaks from the upper works through the Indian Pass. And McIntyre found this so awe-inspiring. And this letter gives you an idea of how he would express himself in Victorian terms. And I'll illustrate where it's an actual quote by air quotes. So the other stuff is from me, but it's not a lot. Most of it's from McIntyre. Dear Mr. Church, we had our first glimpse of the fabled Indian Pass a week ago last Sunday. Oh, how I had dreamed of that moment. A difficult trail leads from the village of Adirondack along a small stream to the pass. And here's the quote. Quote, after walking a long time, we began to catch occasional glimpses of the wonder through the trees, holding its jagged masses of rocks above us in the open sky and forming an outline upon the blue that I trembled to look upon. Yet we were a long distance off, and the nearer we approached, the more tremendous it appeared. At the foot of where the precipice first commences, we stopped at a spring and drained. From here we got the best view of it looking east, although it was somewhat obstructed by the intervening foliage. Up it sprang from our feet, a perpendicular wall of broken rock, trembling above us, 2,000 feet in the air. This hard and rugged outline, downward again, away beyond us. All around us lay huge rocks that had thundered down from the steep in the forgotten ages, and now lichenous and gray, rested in the wild gorge. Such a scene of grandeur, of sublimity and wildness, I had not anticipated, and it far surpassed my wildest and most fanciful imaginings. That's McIntyre. Quote. Now, he goes on a little bit to talk about establishing a camp at Henderson Lake, but I'm going to skip that. We intended to return to the pass as soon as we were able with our sketching tools, but first we had to attend the setting of camp. This task took a little longer than expected. On the first day, we were free from other duties. It rained all day, requiring us to sit in camp in, quote, lazy anxiety. Wednesday, however, dawned gray, but by the time we finished our breakfast, the sky had cleared. Joe and I, with Puffer's help, carried our sketching supplies the 4 miles back to Indian Pass. Puffer brought along an axe so as to cut down trees to improve our view. We selected a good scene after clambering over the rocks to look over a few candidates. Puffer presently returned to camp while Joe and I set to work on our sketches at last. We sketched until the sun began to slip behind the mountains that overshadow the pass. Quote, there was the same soft light upon the hills that enveloped them the first time we saw them. Santinoni and Panther Mountain, on which the soft blue shadows slept, bounded the view, and between them and the precipice, the lesser hills swelled out their wooded sides, which towards evening presented the richest color I had ever seen. The sun was going down behind them, leaving all but the edges and summits in shade, that deep, dreamy shade that cannot be painted or described, but must be seen to be felt. When the light stole across the tops, it made them almost of a golden hue, and darting in among the dark masses of evergreens on the ridge of the mountain nearest the precipice gave an almost enchanting effect to the view. It is one of those wild scenes so full of majesty and sublimity which the Creator has formed for us to look upon, that we may better comprehend his boundless power. And yet, those who would look upon it must endure no little toil for the privilege, for its gateway is of the rugged rock and the tangled forest, and the feet that pass through it are few, as the hardly discernible path will attest. End of the quote. How I wish you were here to share this endeavor. I will come to New York as soon as I'm able to show you the results of my artistic labors. Sincerely, your friend, Jervis. Now that gives you an idea of why this is a great story. This guy could write. He wrote in a way that we don't write today. His Victorian style and his enthusiasm just comes through every one of the letters. And so when you read this, you can sort of almost feel that you're there with him. Now, unfortunately, the sketches that they made during these trips are now lost, and the subsequent finished paintings are not in any public collection. I feel certain, however, that somewhere, in some living room or some attic someplace, McEntee and Tubby's sketches and paintings of the past still exist. I just can't find out where they are. Now, an oil sketch of a mountain scene by McEntee was sold at auction back in 2012, and it bears a resemblance to the Indian Pass. Let's go to the next slide. This actually is a very small painting. It's 6 by 12 inches. And this painting, I think, does resemble the area that he saw. But my efforts to find its current location have been unsuccessful. It went into private hands. The auction house is not open to giving me where it is. But this is an image from an online auction site called Invaluable, which shows the auction house as a watermark and so on. It's titled Mountain Wisdom. Okay, next slide. So I'll wrap this up a little bit. I want to show you a little bit about their later work. After the sketching trip, for the rest of their lives, both artists enjoyed distinguished careers as landscape painters. Immediately following the 1851 trip, Jervis McEntee returned to his parents' home in Rondell. He went to work in his uncle's flower and feed store to make some money, and while he continued to paint part-time. 1853, he was able to build his own art studio adjacent to his parents' home. The studio was designed by Albert Box, who would later design Church's home, Milan. You may have seen. 3 years after the trip, in 1854, Jervis married Anna Gertrude Sawyer, and they expanded the Rondell Art Studio into their home. In 1855, McEntee took out an ad saying he was now a full-time landscape painter with his own studio. And for the rest of his life, he made a living, full-time, as a painter. Here are a few examples of his later work that I like. In 1863, McEntee came back to the Adirondacks with fellow artists Sanford Robinson Gifford and Richard William Hubbard. Together they visited Lake George, the Champlain Valley, the High Peaks, Lake Placid, and Blue Mountain Lake. There's at least one surviving finished painting by McEntee based on sketches from this trip titled Near Bolton, Lake George. That's the next one. This is an idea of what he's capable of. Now, he's still a young man, and he's just getting going. But this is a pretty good idea of what talent this guy has. Then McEntee and Gifford returned to the Adirondacks again in August and September of 1866, this time accompanied by Gifford's sister, Mary, and McEntee's wife, Gertrude Sawyer. Their primary objective seems to have been to climb Mount Marcy. And there's drawings of these guys and the women in Victorian clothes climbing Mount Marcy. And they went from Pea Valley up through the Ausable Lakes, up that way. Sketches made during this trip, McEntee Those sketches exist in the Detroit Institute of the Arts. McEntee made at least one finished painting of an early morning view of Whiteface Mountain that he titled Lake Placid Adirondack Mountains, next one. So this gives you one of those atmospheric, he liked painting foggy scenes and things like that, cloudy scenes. And so this is a good example of that kind of painting that we did. That's 1868. Now McEntee, after this, began to specialize in paintings that were set in the fall and the early winter. McEntee's distinctive choice of fall and winter scenes for his later paintings gave the view that he had a melancholy personality. This journal and this trip does not show him to have a melancholy personality at all, so I don't agree with it at all. But he wrote in his journal, "Many say that I paint the sorrowful side of nature, but this is a mistake. Nature is not sad to me, but quiet, pensive, restful." So here's one of his earlier fall scenes that I like so much. I have a framed print of it hanging where I can see it every day. It's titled Gray Day in Hill Country. So this is a later, somewhat later, and this gives you an idea of that scene that he captures a feeling that I don't think you see in a lot of other Hudson River School paintings. And do you have a question, Brian?
No, I was pointing out just the foreground.
Oh, yeah.
The not just the landscape, but the foreground work is exceptional.
You know, and then I want to show you one more, which is, I think, one of the best paintings that he did. It's called Over the Hills and Far Away. This is him, next one. This is him at full power. This is a very large painting. It's at the New York Historic Society. I got to see the original of this recently at the Munson Art Museum in Utica. This copy doesn't do it justice, but it's the same thing you were saying, Brian. If you look at the foreground and the distance, this is a remarkable painting. And if you can imagine this about 5 times the size of that, it's really, you can get lost in this painting. It's really astounding. So that gives you some idea of McEntee as a mature artist. As for Tubby, following the 1851 sketching trip, he went back to work in his father's contracting business. In 1852, 2 of his paintings were exhibited at the National Academy of Design. In 1858, he married Ella Hopkins, who was the daughter of a minister of the local church in Rondell. They had 6 children. After his marriage, he became more deeply involved and eventually took over his father's contracting business. The success of the contracting business allowed him financial freedom to pursue art part-time. He continued to paint with modest success. He was exhibited for the rest of his life. Here are a few of my favorites. Because of his family and business responsibilities, Tubby's later paintings feature scenes from the Hudson River Valley and the nearby Catskills. Here's an example completed not long after the Adirondack trip titled View of the Hudson River from Kingston. So there you get a sense of that. It's quite different from McEntee's paintings, but it's got that same sort of idea of looking off into the distance. Although many of Tubby's later paintings feature similar long views, he could also focus on wild natural features. So here's an example of a painting from 1884 that captures a mountain stream in the Catskills near Jewett. That'll give you a sense of that detail and the ability to capture natural. And there's even a couple of guys fishing, you know, it's just sort of, it's pretty typical Hudson River School, but detailed. Tubby didn't give up on sketching trips. He did go on them, but infrequently. And images from those trips don't exist in public collections. However, recently, a man named Sanford Levy, a leading Tubby scholar and a collector, acquired this magnificent Tubby sketch from a scene near Wilton, New Hampshire. This is a little distorted because it's, you know, took it with his phone and it was tilting, but this gives you a sense of his power as a mature artist. Tubby also returned to the Adirondacks late in life, and he did a scene of the sunset at Star Lake, which is in the collection of the Adirondack Experience Museum. Interestingly, the coloration and arrangement are quite similar to another painting he did of a sunset on Lake Mohawk, now in the collection of the Mohawk Mountains. It's the same kind of coloration and so on. But this is an interesting painting, and it's a little bit more abstract and a little bit more impressionistic than any of his other works. All right. So let me see if I can wind this up for you. McEntee claims in the Lake of the Wilderness that before departing the high peaks and heading home, he and Tubby assembled a statue, which he called the Genius Loci. He included a sketch of the sculpture perched on a windswept rock, with the artist saluting it from the lower left-hand corner. Let's see the next one. They were going with, there's no mention of this statue in his journals. There's no mention of it anywhere else but in this magazine article. So I don't think it ever actually existed. In fact, I'm not sure it could exist given the position of a frying pan, except as a metaphor. But it is a metaphor for the trip. Now, McEntee had studied Latin in school, and he loved to sprinkle his writings with references to classical literature. The Genius Loci in Roman times referred to the protective spirit watching over a place of worship. By McEntee's time, the phrase had shed its religious connotation and simply meant the distinctive mental impression of a special place. McEntee describes the statue this way, quote, "From a pair of wretchedly dilapidated boots, worn out on weary forest marches, a pair of pantaloons torn and riddled in the Tajas expedition, an old sketching umbrella, and a frying pan, we constructed a statue which we inaugurated as the Genius Loci for all those who would come after us to honor and respect." Unpacking that, the items that he selected symbolize 4 aspects of the Adirondack experience. The tattered sketching umbrella represents the many weeks he and Tubby spent sketching in hard-to-reach wild places. The frying pan represents the challenges and rewards of obtaining food during the trip, which was quite an interesting job for them. The torn pantaloons are a reminder of the successful but difficult, painful climb to Mount Marcy. The boots represent the many miles McEntee slogged along rough trails in inadequate and constantly deteriorating footwear. By placing this statue at the end of the story, McEntee emphasizes the lasting emphasis the sketching trip had on it. The imaginary statue highlights the fact that by the time McEntee left for home, he felt the distinctive spirit of the wild Adirondacks had firmly established itself in his soul and in his art. So I'll be happy to take your questions. Great, thank you. Anybody have any questions?
Yeah, I do.
Go ahead.
And I'd like to, how'd you first come across these two fellows, and what made you decide to find out about them?
Well, that's a good question. It was a complete accident.
Yeah.
To find this, if you just went to the Adirondack Experience Library and said, show me something about art in the Adirondacks, they have giant boxes full of this stuff. So I was working on Beaver River Country, my earlier book, and I was talking to a friend who's a historian or a person who's fond of history. And she said, "Have you ever heard of Judas McEntee?" I said, "I don't know who he is." And she said, "Well, he has this great diary." I said, "Well, okay, why should I look at it?" "Oh, it describes the Beaver River in this wild state." Well, okay, that's interesting. I'd like to look at that. So the next day I get an email with a transcript of the whole diary from her that she had gotten from the Archives of American Art. She paid for it. I didn't, but I think it's still legal. Then I started reading it, and I came across passages like the ones I read here tonight. And I thought, man, this isn't just a description. This is like an entry into Victorian art and Victorian travels. So I had to go. And then from then, it was only 3 years of research. So yeah, there's a lot out there, certainly about Hudson River School painters,
Oh, yeah.
all these other characters. And every one of the letters I researched who the people were that got the letters. So I knew who they were and a little bit about them. And that's all it continued. Anything else?
Well, by the time that, when they do this and they're here in the high peaks, how much of the high peaks had been at least, surveyed in some way? Had the mountains been named? I mean, how much was known
Yeah.
about the area?
A fair amount was known. There was a real good book by Sandra Weber called Mount Marcy. It explains that early part of the description of 46ers had books about the early parts. So to get to Mount Marcy, for example, there was no marked trail. But they walked around in the village of Adirondack and asked people, have you been up there? How do you go? And one of the people actually took them up to the Opalescent River and said, just follow this and go up there. You'll find an open camp up there just at the tree line, and then from there you just scramble up. Yes, that's what they do. So yeah, but a lot of the peaks remain. Not all of them today that we have today, and the names are not all the same.
Yeah.
Obviously, yeah.
None of those sketches show any log cabins of any sort.
Right.
And yet that road they were on went, what did you say, a couple hundred miles or whatever?
Yeah.
So were there no, who built the road through the state or the federal government, and were there no settlers that built along that road?
Right, well, the idea was that they would build it, the state paid for it. And it was put together with a couple of the different counties along the way. And it was surveyed out, but paid for. The axe part, cleaning it out, was paid for by the state. And the idea was that when the settlers came, they would be charged for the mileage that they went along the road. That would be their tax. But that didn't work. It didn't ever happen. But Long Lake Village was already there. It had 6 houses. And they were stretched along Long Lake from Deerland all the way up to what's now the village. So if you imagine 6 houses stretched along there. So the famous guy, Mitchell Sabattis, had a house there, for example, at that time. So yeah, there were some houses. On the cover, there's a log cabin on the book. And this cabin was at Racket Lake, but it was by a squatter and a hermit named Wood. But it was actually a pretty firm cabin, and there was another one across the lake at Indian Corps as well. So there were some various ones. I described some other squatters' cabins as you go through the book. So there were some, but the Carthage and Lake Champlain Road never did actually generate settlers. Maybe a few at Long Lake. Anybody else?
So just when you say squatters' cabins, at that point, like if you just went off into the woods and built your cabin, how did you get to own it, so to speak?
You did.
The squat.
You did. But you could keep it until 1916.
16?
1916. In 1916, the state decided that there could be no more squatters on Forest Preserve. And in 1916, they evicted 970 squatters from across the Adirondacks. So there were a few.
Yeah.
And it took them a while to get all those people off of there. And they gave people time to move their stuff. But their stuff was back there, and the cabins were made out of logs and bark, and, a lot of them just either deteriorated or were burned in.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was wonderful. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you so much.
Great.